In the quiet town of Everbrook, an injured Marine stands at attention, saluting the gravestone of his fallen brother-in-arms. His body trembles, wounds unhealed, but his resolve is unshaken. As the hours pass, the world watches, but it is the rumble of approaching motorcycles that changes everything. What happens next is beyond anyone's expectation. A story of honor, redemption, and an act of brotherhood that transcends time. The wind carried a chill through the open cemetery, rustling the American flags planted beside the tombstones. It was late afternoon, and the sky carried the weight of an approaching storm. The lone figure of a Marine stood rigid, his feet shoulder-width apart, his right hand raised in a sharp salute. His uniform, though neatly pressed, bore the stains of time, his sleeves concealing the scars that ran deeper than flesh. He had arrived at dawn, determined to fulfill a promise. His body, still weak from injuries sustained months prior, screamed for rest, but his mind remained resolute. The gravestone before him bore the name of his best friend, the one he had sworn to protect but had ultimately failed. Now, standing in this solemn place, he vowed to hold his salute for 24 hours, a tribute to the brother-in-arms he had lost. At first, there had been no one to witness the act, just the wind, the trees, and the weight of his grief pressing down on him like an anchor. But as the hours passed, cemetery visitors began to take notice. Some stole quick glances before walking on, unsure of what to make of the scene. Others lingered, sensing the gravity of his silence. A young mother, pushing a stroller, paused long enough to whisper a quiet prayer. An elderly veteran, his cane tapping against the pavement, nodded in understanding before moving along. Slowly, the presence of an audience began to form. Pain shot through his wounded leg and he fought to keep his balance. The doctors had warned him that standing too long could reopen the stitches in his side, but he clenched his jaw and ignored the warning echoing in his mind. His body could break if it had to. He would not abandon this post. A local news crew, tipped off by a cemetery worker, arrived around midday. The camera operator adjusted his lens while a reporter whispered into her microphone. They were hesitant at first, unsure if they should approach. But the sight of the Marine, unmoving despite his obvious agony, told them everything they needed to know. The camera rolled, capturing the stark image of sacrifice and devotion. By early evening, the cemetery was no longer empty. Small groups of people had gathered, their murmurs filling the silence. A teenage boy, wearing a military academy sweatshirt, saluted him from a distance. A woman with graying hair wiped tears from her eyes, clutching the folded flag that once belonged to her son. They did not speak to the Marine, nor did he acknowledge them. His gaze remained locked forward, his thoughts drifting between past and present. His mind wandered back to the last time he had seen his best friend alive. It had been a routine mission, or at least that was what they had told themselves. A patrol in enemy territory. The sun burning overhead, the dust thick in the air. He remembered the sound of laughter, the way they had joked about what they would do when they finally got home. He remembered the explosion, the gunfire, the desperate scramble to pull his friend to safety. And then, the silence, the kind that stretched across an entire lifetime. Now, standing at his grave, the Marine felt the weight of his failure more than ever. His friend had been full of life, with dreams that would never come to pass. A brother, a son, a soldier, gone too soon, and he, the one who had sworn to protect him, was left behind, trapped in a cycle of guilt that never seemed to loosen its grip. A sharp gust of wind nearly knocked him off balance, but he steadied himself. The sky had darkened considerably, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The news crew, now joined by more journalists, pulled out umbrellas. The crowd grew larger, their whispers turning into hushed conversations. Speculation spread among them. How long had he been standing there? Would he make it through the night? A cemetery worker, sensing the Marine's worsening condition, hesitated before stepping forward. "Sir," he said softly, his voice carrying concern, "you don't have to do this." The Marine did not respond. His body ached, his vision blurred, but he did not move. Minutes passed, then an hour. The rain turned heavier, soaking through his uniform. His injured leg trembled, the pain now a searing fire through his body. Still, he held his salute. Then the sound came. A deep, thunderous rumble in the distance. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the patter of the rain. But as it grew louder, heads turned, eyes searching for the source. Motorcycles. The unmistakable growl of engines approaching, a fleet of them, cutting through the quiet reverence of the cemetery. The crowd parted as the riders arrived, men clad in leather, their vests adorned with patches bearing military insignias. Some bore scars of their own, others had tattoos commemorating fallen brothers. They parked their bikes in a solemn line and dismounted. One of them, an older man with a graying beard, stepped forward. He removed his helmet, locking eyes with the Marine. Then, in a single motion, he raised his hand in salute. One by one, the others followed. The Marine, for the first time in hours, felt something shift within him. A crack in the wall he had built around his grief. These men understood. They had lived through the same losses, carried the same burdens. And now they stood with him, bearing the weight together. The storm raged on, but the Marine did not falter. Not now, not yet. The night was just beginning. The night settled over the cemetery like a heavy shroud, the distant streetlights casting long shadows between the gravestones. The Marine remained unmoving, his salute unwavering despite the cold creeping into his bones. His mind, however, was no longer in the present. As exhaustion seeped into his limbs, memories surfaced, pulling him back to a time before loss, before guilt became his constant companion. Afghanistan. The sand was relentless, whipping against his skin as he adjusted his helmet. The desert sun burned high above them, casting everything in a golden haze. He turned to his left, where his best friend stood, flashing that same reckless grin he always wore before a mission. "You ready for this?" his friend had asked, nudging him with an elbow. He had smirked, shaking his head. "Like I have a choice?" They had always been that way, side by side, watching each other's backs. They had trained together, suffered together, and dreamed of a future that now only existed in one man's mind. The mission had been routine, a patrol through contested territory. Intelligence had indicated minimal enemy presence, nothing they couldn't handle. He remembered the sound of boots against the cracked earth, the heat pressing down on them, and the distant hum of a helicopter cutting across the sky. Then everything changed. A sudden explosion, a deafening roar that shattered the air and sent debris flying in all directions. The force of it lifted him off his feet, slamming him hard into the dirt. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Through the haze of dust he saw his friend lying motionless a few feet away, half buried under rubble. He had crawled to him, ignoring the sharp pain tearing through his side. "Come on, man, stay with me," he had whispered, gripping his friend's vest, shaking him. Blood. Too much blood. The sand drank it greedily, and he realized with a sinking heart that the wound was fatal. His friend had coughed, his fingers weakly gripping his sleeve. "You. Gotta get out of here," he had choked out. "Not without you," the Marine had growled, fighting to hoist him up. But his friend had shaken his head. "Promise me." His voice was barely a whisper now, the light in his eyes flickering. "You make it home. You live for me." Then, just like that, he was gone. The present weighs heavy. The present slammed back into him like a freight train. His body trembled from the cold, his vision blurred from more than just exhaustion. He was gripping his right forearm without realizing it, his nails digging into the fabric of his uniform. The pain in his leg, the ache in his ribs. It all paled in comparison to the unbearable weight in his chest. A part of him had died that day in the desert, left behind in the wreckage of that ambush. And yet he had made it home. He had walked off the battlefield while his best friend had been carried out in a flag-draped casket. His throat tightened as he stared at the name etched into the gravestone before him. His promise had been to live. But had he really? Or had he merely been surviving, haunted by ghosts and guilt? A soft rustling behind him pulled him from his thoughts. More people had gathered. He could hear them now. Whispers, the shuffling of feet, the occasional sniffle. The news had spread beyond the cemetery. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting his silent tribute to anyone willing to watch. But none of it mattered. Not the crowd, not the cameras, not the growing murmurs of concern. What mattered was the man beneath the stone before him, the promise he had made, and the fact that for the first time in years he was facing his past rather than running from it. His knees threatened to buckle, his body screamed for rest, but his mind clung desperately to the memories, as if afraid that letting go of the pain meant letting go of his best friend entirely. For years he had convinced himself that survivor's guilt was the only thing keeping him from forgetting, that if he stopped feeling the pain, stopped replaying those final moments, he would be betraying the very man he had sworn to honor. But was it true? Would his best friend have wanted him to carry this burden for a lifetime? He remembered the way they had laughed between missions, the way his friend had talked about going home, starting fresh. His dream had been simple: to buy a house by the lake, to get married, to raise a family away from war and bloodshed. He had wanted peace. And yet, here the Marine stood, a prisoner of his own grief, living, but not really alive. A cold gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, making him shiver. The night was growing colder, the hours stretching longer. He had lost track of time, though the growing crowd suggested that he had been standing there far longer than anyone expected. The pain in his leg intensified, a deep throbbing sensation that warned him of his limits. His body was still healing, barely strong enough to walk without limping. The doctors had told him to take it easy, but what did they know about debts that could never be repaid? His muscles ached, his throat was dry, but he would not falter. His friend had died believing in him, trusting that he would carry forward, that he would find purpose in living. And so, he would stand. For the next 24 hours, he would endure. He would bear the weight of his memories, the unspoken words, the lingering sorrow. Because some debts could never be repaid, only honored. The cemetery remained silent except for the rustling of trees and the occasional murmurs of the crowd. Cameras continued rolling, broadcasting his solitary vigil to the world beyond this small patch of sacred ground. He had 24 hours to remember, to mourn, to heal, and, for now, that was enough. The night deepened, and with it came the first distant rumble of thunder. The Marine barely noticed. His focus remained unshaken, locked onto the gravestone before him. His breath was slow and measured, but each inhale felt like dragging air through his aching ribs. His body was breaking down, but his will was steadfast. He had made a promise. Nothing, not even the storm on the horizon, would stop him now. The cemetery had grown quieter. Most visitors had left, though a few remained, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of their phones. The news crews, sensing a more dramatic turn in the story, adjusted their cameras, waiting for nature to add to the spectacle. Every so often, someone approached cautiously, standing a few feet away, hesitant to break the solemnity of the moment. No one spoke to him directly. Perhaps they understood. This was not about them. The Marine shifted slightly, sending sharp pain through his injured leg. His body had long since gone numb to the cold, but his wounds were a different matter. The discomfort had grown unbearable, but he had endured worse. Pain was just another test, another battle to win. His lips pressed into a thin line as he focused on the task before him. Not just standing, not just saluting, but remembering. Above, the sky darkened further, the first flashes of lightning illuminating the low-hanging clouds. The storm would be here soon. He thought of his friend again, the way he had laughed, the way he had always been the reckless one, yet had never hesitated when it came to protecting the people around him. One cautious, one daring. But war had no patience for balance. It had stolen one of them and left the other behind, carrying the weight of both lives. Another rumble, this time closer. The Marine's fingers twitched involuntarily, a lingering instinct from years of reacting to sudden noises. His training told him to move, to find shelter, but his heart refused. He was right where he needed to be. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. A figure stood at the edge of the cemetery, partially concealed by the tree line. The Marine felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The presence was different, not a spectator, not a reporter. The man was watching him, standing still, as if studying him. A flash of lightning momentarily illuminated the figure. A leather jacket, worn boots, a stance that spoke of experience. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. The Marine forced himself to look away, refocusing on his vigil. Whoever the man was, he would deal with it later. The wind picked up, rattling the small flags planted beside the graves. The scent of rain filled the air, signaling the inevitable. He could hear murmurs from the remaining crowd, concerned voices discussing whether the storm would force him to stop. But he wouldn't stop. The first raindrops splattered against his uniform, darkening the fabric. The coolness against his skin should have been a relief, but his body was too exhausted to register anything beyond pain and resolve. The weight of his salute remained steady, though his muscles had begun to tremble. His mind drifted back to Afghanistan, to the sound of radio chatter, to the warnings they had ignored. The night before that mission, his best friend had been unusually quiet. He had spoken about home, about the girl he planned to propose to. He had asked a simple question. "Do you ever wonder if we're making it out of this?" The Marine had shrugged, not wanting to entertain the thought. "We have to," he had said. His friend had only nodded as if he already knew. Thunder cracked overhead, snapping him back to the present. The rain had started falling in earnest now, soaking through his uniform. Some in the cemetery moved toward their cars, while others lingered, unwilling to leave just yet. The reporters had covered their cameras, but they were still filming. The storm had only made the moment more profound. The Marine felt his body sway, the exhaustion clawing at him. He knew he was nearing his limit. But it wasn't time yet. Not yet. From the shadows, the man in the leather jacket took a step forward. The Marine saw him this time, clearly now that the rain had begun to clear the mist from the cemetery grounds. The man's face was lined, his beard peppered with gray, his eyes sharp despite the softness of age. He looked like someone who had seen his own share of battles, someone who understood. He didn't speak. He didn't approach further. He simply stood there, watching. The Marine felt an odd sense of familiarity, though he knew they had never met. Something about the way the man carried himself, the way he stood with his shoulders squared, feet planted firmly. There was a language here, one only those who had lived through war could understand. A silent recognition. Then, in a move so subtle that the cameras likely wouldn't notice, the man raised his hand in a slow, steady salute. The Marine swallowed hard. For a moment, just a brief one, he didn't feel so alone. The rain had turned into a downpour now. The remaining onlookers huddled under umbrellas, their voices barely audible over the storm. One of the cemetery workers, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, gestured toward a security officer. "Should we stop him?" the worker asked. "He's going to hurt himself." The officer hesitated. "He's a Marine," he said finally. "If he wants to stand, he's going to stand." The worker frowned, looking toward the Marine with uncertainty. "And if he collapses?" The officer sighed. "Then we catch him." The Marine barely heard them. The storm had swallowed the world, leaving only the sound of his own breathing, the rain pounding against the ground, and the silent presence of the man watching from the shadows. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cemetery in stark brightness before plunging it back into darkness. his vision blurred, his muscles locked in place. He wasn't sure how much longer he could last. But he wasn't done yet. His friend's name on the gravestone was all the strength he needed. He would endure. For him. The storm raged on, but the Marine remained standing. His uniform was soaked through, the fabric clinging to his skin like a second layer of armor. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but he ignored the pain, keeping his salute firm, his gaze fixed forward. The name on the gravestone was his anchor, his reason for enduring. The cold rain blurred the world around him, but he refused to falter. The storm had driven many away. Only a few remained, figures huddled under umbrellas, their eyes locked onto the solitary Marine standing in defiance of the elements. Among them was a man in a battered pickup truck who had driven across 2 states to get here. A veteran himself, he had seen the news coverage and felt something deep within him stir. This Marine, this stranger, was standing for all of them, for all the ones they had lost. He gripped the wheel, his throat tightening as memories of his own fallen brothers resurfaced. He had to be here. He had to see it with his own eyes. Across the cemetery, a woman stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she approached, clutching something close to her chest. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with sorrow. In her hands, she held a folded American flag, the one that had been presented to her at her son's funeral. She stopped a few feet from the Marine, looking at him with an understanding that words could never convey. The Marine noticed her presence but did not break his salute. The pain in his leg was becoming unbearable, but he locked his knees, refusing to let weakness win. The woman watched him for a long moment before slowly kneeling in front of the gravestone. With careful hands, she placed the folded flag at its base. Her fingers lingered on the stone, tracing the engraved name. She closed her eyes, whispering something only she and the fallen could hear. The Marine felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen this moment before, at other funerals, in other cemeteries. The quiet grief of a mother mourning her child, a pain that never truly healed. He wanted to say something, but there were no words that could ease that kind of sorrow. So he did the only thing he could do. He stood. A gust of wind cut through the cemetery, and for the first time since he had begun, the Marine felt his body sway. His grip tightened, his jaw clenched. He couldn't show weakness. Not here, not now. The woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. She took a step closer, her voice barely audible over the rain. "He was like you," she said softly. Strong, stubborn, always putting others before himself. The Marine swallowed hard. He still did not speak, but his silence was an answer in itself. She studied him for a moment before giving him a solemn nod. Then, with deliberate care, she raised her hand in salute. For the first time, the Marine's vision blurred, not from the rain but from something deeper, something raw. His chest tightened, and before he could stop it, a single tear slipped down his cheek. He did not break his salute. But the first tear had fallen. The moment had been caught on camera. The live broadcast captured the Marine's silent strength, the mother's quiet grief, and the tear falling down his cheek. People watching from their homes, their phones, their offices, many of them veterans, felt the weight of that image. Despite the storm, more people arrived. Some had never served but had lost family members. Others were veterans who had once stood at attention just like the Marine. They came in silence, moving past rows of gravestones to stand at a respectful distance. A young man in a military academy uniform stepped forward. He hesitated only a moment before raising his own salute. Behind him, a woman carrying a small child placed a hand over her heart. More followed. One by one, strangers joined in the tribute, forming a quiet wall of respect around the Marine. The man in the pickup truck stepped out, his knees aching from too many years spent carrying weight that never truly left. He adjusted the cap on his head, the same one he had worn since his own days in uniform and made his way through the cemetery. His chest tightened at the sight of the Marine, still standing, still saluting despite the clear toll on his body. He had been where that young man was now, had lost people, had struggled with the guilt of surviving. Even after years of trying to move forward, it had never really left him. He stopped beside the grieving mother, who turned to look at him with recognition. "You lost someone too," she said. "Many," he replied. Neither spoke further. They didn't need to. The Marine's muscles burned, his vision swimming. The cold, the pain, it all blurred into one sensation, a distant ache compared to the grief he carried. His body was screaming at him to stop, but he refused. His fallen friend had not had a choice to stand or fall. But he did. He had to stand. His fingers twitched, his shoulders ached. His body was beginning to shake. He knew what was coming. His body was failing him. And yet, even as the exhaustion crept in, he realized something. He was no longer standing alone. The first tear had fallen, but it would not be the last. The Marine could feel it now, the emotions he had buried, the grief he had refused to acknowledge. It was rising, a tide he could no longer keep at bay. His fallen brother's name stood before him, unchanging, a constant reminder. And yet, for the first time since the battle that had stolen his best friend, he did not feel trapped in that moment. The salute remained. The storm raged on, and the Marine stood, surrounded by strangers who understood without needing to speak. They stood with him, and he was no longer alone. The storm had begun to ease, but the Marine remained unshaken. His muscles were stiff, his uniform clung to his skin, and the weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on him. Yet he stood tall, his salute unbroken. The crowd had grown, their silent respect surrounding him like an unseen force. The first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds when a new sound pierced the quiet, one that rumbled deep in the earth, growing louder with each second. A low, rolling thunder of engines filled the cemetery. It started as a distant growl, but soon the sound grew into a roar that commanded attention. Motorcycles, dozens of them, emerged from the road leading to the cemetery, their headlights slicing through the misty morning air. The ground trembled beneath their approach, a force both powerful and deliberate. People turned toward the sight, eyes widening as the convoy rode in. The Marine didn't move, but he heard them coming. His ears recognized the sound instantly. Not just any bikers, these were men who carried the weight of war in their veins. Veterans, brothers of the fallen. A hush spread through the cemetery as the bikes rolled in and came to a halt. A man stepped forward first. He was older, his grizzled beard streaked with gray, his arms lined with inked memorials, names of soldiers who never made it home. He removed his helmet and held it under his arm, his gaze locked onto the Marine standing before the gravestone. His presence was commanding, but his eyes held something deeper. Understanding. Respect. He gave a nod to the others, and as if answering an unspoken command, the bikers followed suit. They removed their helmets, revealing faces marked by time, experience, and loss. One by one they approached. The leader stepped closer, stopping a few feet from the Marine. He studied the young man before him, the rigid posture, the trembling muscles fighting exhaustion. Without hesitation, he raised his right hand and offered a slow, steady salute. The Marine saw it, and something in his chest tightened. Then, like a ripple in still water, the rest of the bikers followed. A row of veterans, standing shoulder to shoulder, raised their hands in unison. A silent tribute. The cemetery held its breath. The Marine felt something stir inside him, something he had kept buried for too long. For the first time since he had started this vigil, he did not feel alone. The bikers lowered their salutes after a long moment, their presence a statement stronger than words. The leader took a step forward, his boots crunching against the damp earth. His gaze remained locked onto the Marine. "You're standing for him," the older man said. His voice was rough but steady. The Marine swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his body screaming for rest, but he managed a small nod. The leader exhaled, looking at the gravestone. "Then we'll stand with you." A murmur spread through the crowd. A few people wiped at their eyes. The news crews, still present, recorded every second. But none of that mattered to the Marine. What mattered was the men before him, the ones who understood, the ones who knew this kind of pain. One of the bikers, a younger man with a prosthetic leg, stepped forward. His jacket bore patches from past deployments, and as he looked at the Marine, there was something in his expression, familiarity. "I knew him," the biker said. The Marine's breath caught. The biker gestured to the gravestone. "We served together, before he joined your unit." The weight of those words hit the Marine like a shockwave. He had spent so much time carrying the guilt of that day, the pain of losing his best friend. But here was another man who had known him, fought beside him, someone who carried his own grief. The Marine's legs threatened to give out. He adjusted his stance, forcing himself to stay upright. "He talked about you," the biker continued, his voice softer now. "Said you were like a brother, that if anything ever happened to him, he knew you'd carry on." The Marine closed his eyes for a brief second. The rain had long since stopped, but his face was damp, not just from the storm. The leader of the bikers gave a solemn nod. "We don't leave our own behind, and we don't let them carry the weight alone." Without another word, the bikers moved. Some stood behind the Marine, a silent formation of support. Others knelt beside the grave, whispering quiet prayers or leaving behind tokens of remembrance. Dog tags, challenge coins, patches from their old units, small symbols of a bond that never truly faded. The Marine's vision blurred. He wanted to speak, to thank them, but his throat was too tight. Instead, he just stood, his heart pounding as the weight on his chest felt just a little lighter. Then one of the bikers stepped forward, an older man with deep lines on his face. He unfastened a patch from his jacket, one that bore an insignia the Marine recognized instantly. It had belonged to his friend's old unit. The man extended it toward him. The Marine hesitated before reaching out with a shaking hand and accepting it. He stared down at the patch, his fingers curling around the fabric. A symbol of loyalty, of sacrifice, of brotherhood. For the first time since he had begun this tribute, the Marine felt something he hadn't in a long time. Strength. Not the kind that came from standing alone, but the kind that came from standing together. The sun had begun to rise, casting light over the gravestones. The Marine exhaled, his body aching, his mind heavy, but his heart steady. The bikers had come, and they were standing with him. The sun was beginning to rise, casting soft golden light over the cemetery. The Marine remained standing, his salute steady despite the unbearable ache in his limbs. The presence of the bikers had given him strength, their silent tribute reinforcing his purpose. But exhaustion clawed at his body, his vision swimming as he struggled to stay upright. The leader of the bikers, the grizzled man with the memorial tattoos, stepped closer. He studied the Marine, carefully, as if measuring his resilience. Then, in a voice low but firm, he said, "We were his brothers too." The Marine's fingers twitched. He barely had the strength to turn his head, but he forced himself to meet the man's gaze. "Your friend. He was one of us before he was with you. We served together in his first unit," the man continued. His voice carried the weight of loss but also of loyalty. "We made a pact a long time ago. Whoever made it out, we'd watch over the families of the ones who didn't." The Marine's breath hitched. He had never known. The guilt that had been his constant companion tightened around his chest. One of the younger bikers, the one with the prosthetic leg, spoke next. His voice was softer but steady. "We were deployed together. He saved my life more than once. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here." Another biker, a tall man with a thick beard, nodded. "He was fearless. Wouldn't think twice about running into fire if it meant bringing one of us home." The Marine's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He had always known his best friend was brave, but hearing it from others, those who had fought beside him, made it more real. "He talked about you," the leader continued. "Said you were like a brother. If he ever didn't make it back, he knew you'd keep his memory alive." The Marine clenched his jaw. His knees wobbled. He was at his limit, but he would not fall. Not yet. The younger biker placed a hand on his own chest where a row of dog tags hung. "He saved me, man. More times than I can count. I owe him my life." Another added, "We all do." The Marine's throat burned. He had spent so long drowning in guilt, believing he had failed. But these men, these warriors, were telling him a different story, one he had never let himself hear. The leader took another step forward. His expression was firm but kind. "You're not alone in this." The Marine's vision blurred, but not from exhaustion. The wind carried the scent of wet grass and earth. The air was cool, but sweat clung to the Marine's skin. His legs trembled, his body begging him to stop. Yet he held on. His fingers curled into a rigid salute, his feet rooted to the ground. "Brother," the leader said, his voice steady, "you've been standing alone for too long." The Marine's breath came in shallow gasps. He swayed slightly, the world around him flickering in and out of focus. The voices of the bikers, the murmurs of the crowd, the distant clicking of cameras. It all became a distant hum beneath the roar of exhaustion. He wanted to respond. He wanted to say something, anything, but his body was betraying him. The bearded biker stepped forward. "Listen to me," he said. "He wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you to destroy yourself over guilt." The Marine gritted his teeth. He wasn't doing this out of guilt. He was doing this because he had to, because his best friend deserved it. But was that really the whole truth? His head spun. His vision darkened at the edges. He could feel his pulse hammering against his skull. A voice in his head whispered that it was time to stop, that he had done enough. But another voice, one that sounded so much like his best friend, told him to stand. So he did. The bikers took turns stepping forward, sharing stories of the fallen, tales of bravery, of laughter, of moments that only those who had served together could truly understand. "He used to steal extra rations and hand them out to the new guys," one of them chuckled, told them it was initiation. Another grinned. "Remember when he fixed that generator with duct tape and a prayer? Had the whole base running off it for a week before command found out." The Marine felt his lips twitch, just barely. It had been so long since he had let himself think about the good memories. "He had your back, always," the leader said, his tone serious again. "And he knew you had his." The Marine's chest tightened. "You didn't fail him." His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself. His fingers twitched against his forehead, the weight of the salute growing heavier by the second. "You didn't fail him," the leader repeated. "He wouldn't want you to carry this alone." The Marine squeezed his eyes shut. The words pierced through him, cracking something deep within. The pain, the guilt, the grief. It was all too much. And yet, as he stood there, listening to these men who had fought beside his best friend, he felt something shift. A burden he hadn't realized he was carrying alone began to lighten. The younger biker stepped forward one last time, holding something small in his hand. "He wanted you to have this." The Marine blinked, his breath hitching as the biker placed a worn, weathered challenge coin in his palm. His best friend's unit insignia was etched into the metal. His vision swam. His chest ached. The coin felt heavy in his hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Brotherhood, loyalty, sacrifice. For the first time since he had begun this tribute, the Marine felt something he hadn't in a long time. Strength. Not the kind that came from standing alone, but the kind that came from standing together. His salute faltered. His body wavered. The world blurred. And then darkness took him. The moment the Marine's body gave out, it was as if time itself slowed. His knees buckled, his muscles finally surrendering to exhaustion. His right hand, the one that had held the salute for so long, began to drop. He fought to keep it raised, but his body betrayed him. The world tilted. Then strong arms caught him before he hit the ground. The grizzled biker leader had moved faster than anyone expected, his reflexes a testament to years of battle-hardened instincts. The Marine's body was limp, his breathing ragged as he sagged into the older man's hold. Another biker stepped in, gripping his other arm to steady him. "Easy, son," the leader murmured. The crowd gasped. Some surged forward, concerned voices rising in awe and fear. The news cameras zoomed in. The Marine's face was pale, his jaw clenched as if he was still trying to fight the collapse. But there was no more strength left to summon. The salute had finally broken. Yet, even as his body gave in, his fingers twitched weakly, still trying to return to position. The younger biker with the prosthetic leg kneeled in front of him, studying his face. His eyes held a mixture of understanding and urgency. "You need to stop, brother. You've done enough." But the Marine shook his head, breath shallow. "Not yet." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the conviction in it was undeniable. The bikers exchanged glances. This man was beyond his limit, his body screaming for mercy, but his heart refused to surrender. From the crowd, a woman pushed past the stunned onlookers. She was in her 40s, wearing a rain-soaked blouse and carried herself with the precision of someone who had spent years saving lives. "I'm a doctor," she announced, kneeling beside the Marine. She pressed 2 fingers against his wrist, checking his pulse. Her frown deepened. "His heart rate is erratic. He's dehydrated on the verge of collapse. He needs medical attention. Now." The bikers hesitated. Anyone could see it. The Marine's hands trembled violently. His breath was shallow, his body shutting down. The leader turned to him, his grip tightening. "Son, listen. You've honored him. You've done your part." The Marine's gaze lifted, barely focusing. His vision swam, darkness creeping in. "Not done," he rasped. The leader exhaled sharply. "If you keep this up, you'll end up right beside him." He gestured to the gravestone. The Marine barely reacted. His body ached so much it had gone beyond pain. Numbness had begun to take over, but still, he fought. He tried to push himself upright, his legs shaking violently beneath him. The bikers held him steady, sharing silent looks of disbelief and admiration. "He won't stop," the younger biker muttered. The doctor shook her head. "If he doesn't, he might not get back up." For a moment, there was only silence. The onlookers, the bikers, the cameras, everyone seemed to hold their breath. Then the Marine did something that stunned them all. He lifted his hand, not to surrender, but to return the salute. His fingers trembled as he forced them to his brow, his arm barely able to hold the weight. His vision blurred, his chest heaving with every painful breath, but he still managed to whisper 2 words through clenched teeth. "Not yet." The bikers looked at each other. The doctor shook her head, exasperated, but something else flickered in her eyes. Respect. The leader sighed, rubbing a hand down his face before turning to his men. His voice was quiet but firm. "If he won't stop, then we stand with him." Without hesitation, every biker straightened. Boots clicked together. Hands rose in unison. One by one, the veterans saluted alongside him. The crowd gasped. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others, overcome with emotion, wiped at their eyes. The Marine still fought against unconsciousness, his body swaying dangerously. The leader of the bikers kept his grip firm, ensuring he didn't fall. "Brother," the younger biker said, voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to do this alone." The Marine's breath shuddered. His grip on reality was slipping, but something in him responded to those words. For the first time, he wasn't just holding on for his fallen friend. He was holding on for everyone here, for the ones who were lost, for the ones who still stood, for the ones who needed to remember. But even a warrior had limits. His body, so conditioned to endure, could take no more. The world spun, the edges of his vision closing in. His lungs burned, his heart pounded erratically in his chest. The bikers must have seen it before he even realized what was happening. The leader stepped closer, lowering his salute. "That's enough, son." The Marine's breath hitched. His knees buckled once more. The older man caught him before he could collapse, lowering him gently to the ground. "Rest now," he murmured. "You've done enough." The Marine fought to stay conscious, to finish what he started, but the exhaustion was relentless, consuming him whole. His salute wavered one last time. And then, the darkness took him completely. The bikers lowered their hands. The crowd erupted, not in fear, but in awe. Some cried, others clapped, their emotions raw and unfiltered. The doctor immediately moved in, checking his pulse, her expression unreadable. The cameras captured every moment. The Marine lay still, his face pale, his body motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. He had given everything. And still he had refused to fall alone. The Marine drifted between consciousness and darkness, his body unwilling to cooperate. The exhaustion was absolute, pressing down on him like a weight he could no longer carry. Yet, even in his weakened state, he could feel the presence around him. A voice, gravelly and firm, cut through the haze. "Then, we'll stand with you." The words settled into his chest, grounding him in the moment. He forced his eyes open, blinking sluggishly. The world swam, a mixture of blurred faces, shifting figures, and the endless gray of the sky. Then, one by one, the bikers stepped forward. The leader was the first to move. His boots scraped against the damp ground as he squared his shoulders. He glanced at the others, men who had known loss, men who had once stood where the Marine now lay. Then, with quiet reverence, he lifted his hand in salute. The others followed without hesitation. One by one, they raised their right hands, taking his place. The Marine tried to speak, but his throat burned. His body screamed in protest as he attempted to lift his arm, to reclaim the salute he had held for so long. But he couldn't. He didn't have the strength. The leader noticed and knelt beside him. His voice was calm but unyielding. "You held it long enough. Let us carry it now." The Marine's breath hitched. He wanted to argue, to protest that this was his burden alone. But as he looked at the men standing in his place, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just his burden. It never had been. The bikers who had once ridden into the cemetery as strangers had now become something more. They were standing for his friend. They were standing for him. The younger biker with the prosthetic leg stepped forward, his jaw clenched. His gaze never left the Marine as he spoke. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "You think this is just about your friend. But it's bigger than that. It's about all of us." Another biker, an older man with deep lines on his face, nodded. "We lost brothers too. We've all stood at graves like this, wondering if we could have done more." The Marine swallowed hard. He had spent so long believing that his pain was unique, that his guilt was his alone to carry. But here were men who had walked the same battlefield, felt the same loss, telling him otherwise. "You don't owe him suffering," the leader added. "You owe him remembrance." The words hit him like a blow. His best friend had died protecting others. His sacrifice hadn't been for sorrow. It had been for life. The Marine's throat tightened. His hands curled into fists against the damp ground. For so long, he had clung to the belief that he had to suffer to honor his friend. But these men, these warriors, were showing him another way. A way that didn't involve carrying the weight alone. The leader took a step forward, his gaze locked onto the Marine. "We made a promise. years ago, a pact. He gestured toward the others. If one of us falls, the rest will stand in his place. We don't forget our own, and we don't leave a brother behind. The Marine's vision blurred, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something raw. The leader extended a hand toward him. "Stand with us, not in pain, but in honor." The Marine hesitated. His body was weak, his limbs barely responding, but the meaning of the words rang through him like an unspoken command. Slowly, shakily, he reached out. The leader grasped his forearm, pulling him upright. The Marine's legs trembled, his balance uncertain. But before he could fall, the others were there, hands gripping his shoulders, holding him steady. Together they stood. The crowd was silent, watching the moment unfold. Some had tears in their eyes. Others placed hands over their hearts. The news cameras captured it all. This unspoken promise, this silent transfer of duty from one soldier to another. The leader turned to the gravestone, his salute unwavering. "We will not forget," he said. His voice was steady, absolute. The Marine swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the name carved into stone. For the first time since his best friend's death, he truly believed it. They would not forget. His body ached, his breath was unsteady, but as he stood among the men who had known his friend, who had fought beside him, who had lost him too, he felt something shift. The burden he had carried alone was no longer his alone to bear. The Marine turned to the leader, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we stand together." The leader nodded. Then, as if responding to an unspoken command, the others followed. The salute had not ended. It had simply changed hands. As the Marine stood, something unexpected happened. The crowd, strangers, veterans, families of fallen soldiers, one by one, began to rise. Some saluted. Others placed hands over their hearts. A few dropped to their knees, hands folded in silent prayer. The cemetery, which had once been filled with sorrow, now radiated with something different. Honor. The tribute would continue, not just today, but beyond. And for the first time in a long time, the Marine believed that was enough. The weight of exhaustion remained, but it no longer felt like a burden he had to carry alone. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And as long as he stood with them, he never would be again. The Marine stood, but his legs trembled beneath him. The weight of exhaustion still clung to him, but now there was something heavier pressing down on his chest. Guilt. Even as the bikers took their places beside him, even as the crowd stood in silent respect, the feeling gnawed at him like an open wound that refused to close. He had failed. His friend was dead, and he was still here. The tribute, the salute, the men standing with him. It should have brought him comfort, but all it did was remind him of the promise he had broken. His best friend had trusted him, and he had let him die. The Marine's fists clenched at his sides. His breath was uneven, his vision blurred, not from exhaustion this time, but from the storm raging inside his mind. He had never spoken about it. Not to his unit, not to his commanding officer, not even to himself. But now, surrounded by those who had known his friend, those who had fought beside him, the truth clawed its way to the surface. And it hurt. The leader of the bikers must have noticed the shift in him, the way his body had gone rigid, the way his jaw was clenched tight. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Talk to me, son." The Marine's breath hitched, his hands curled into fists. "It should have been me." The words escaped before he could stop them. The bikers exchanged glances, but no one interrupted. They just let him speak. "I was his squad leader. He trusted me to bring him home, and I failed." His voice cracked. He had never said it out loud before. "I made the call," he continued. "We were pinned down. We had to move. I told him to cover the left side while I covered the right, but they were waiting for us. The memory hit him like a bullet, the sudden explosion of gunfire, the shout that had cut through the chaos, the moment he had turned to see his best friend collapse, his body jerking from the impact of enemy rounds. "He looked at me," the Marine whispered, "right before he fell, like he knew, like he forgave me before I could even try to save him." His knees threatened to give out. "He died because of my call," he said, shaking his head. "He should be here, not me." The silence stretched between them. The Marine braced himself for judgment, but the leader of the bikers just sighed. Then he placed a heavy hand on the Marine's shoulder. "That's not how it works, son." The Marine frowned, his breath coming in uneven gasps. The leader's voice was calm, steady, but there was something deeper in it. A knowing. "You think you failed him because you were his leader, but we were all leaders. We all made calls. Some ended in victory, some didn't. That's war." The Marine shook his head. "But—" "Listen," the leader interrupted. "He wasn't just your responsibility. He was ours too, and he knew the risks just like we did." Another biker stepped forward, his expression somber. "You think he died because of your decision, but that's not what happened." The Marine clenched his jaw. Then what happened? The older man exhaled slowly, then looked him dead in the eye. "He died protecting you." The Marine's stomach twisted, his chest tightened. "That's what we do," the leader continued. "We protect each other. We fight for each other, and when one of us falls, we carry them with us. Not in guilt, but in honor." The Marine's throat closed. He had spent years punishing himself for something that had never truly been his fault. His best friend hadn't died because of him. He had died for him. Before the Marine could speak, a movement in the crowd caught his eye. A young boy, no older than 10, was making his way toward him, clutching something tightly in his small hands. The Marine blinked. The child's eyes were solemn, his steps careful as he approached. His mother stood behind him, her hands clasped to her chest, tears glistening in her eyes. The boy stopped in front of the Marine, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, he held out what he carried. A folded American flag. The Marine's breath hitched. The boy's voice was quiet but strong. "This was my dad's." The Marine swallowed hard. "He died in combat, too," the boy continued. "And my mom says we have to keep remembering him, that he would want us to be strong, that he wouldn't want us to be sad forever." The Marine's vision blurred. The weight in his chest grew heavier, but it no longer crushed him. The boy took a small step closer. "I think my dad would want you to have this." The Marine's hands shook as he reached forward, carefully taking the flag. His fingers curled around the familiar fabric, the weight of it pressing against his palms. It was more than cloth, more than a symbol. It was belief, the belief that their sacrifices weren't in vain, that their lives mattered, that the ones left behind would carry them forward. Tears slipped down the Marine's face, but he didn't wipe them away. For the first time in years, he wasn't drowning in guilt. He was remembering, honoring, living. The Marine took a deep, shuddering breath, then slowly lowered himself onto one knee. He met the boy's gaze, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you." The boy nodded. Then, in a gesture that made the Marine's breath catch, he lifted his small hand in salute. The Marine returned it, his movements slow but certain. The guilt hadn't disappeared. It probably never would. But for the first time, it no longer controlled him. And as he stood back up, the folded flag clutched in his hands, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. He never had been. And he never would be again. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting golden light over the cemetery. The Marine still stood, though the pain in his limbs was unbearable. The folded flag rested against his chest, a weight both heavy and comforting. The bikers remained by his side, their presence grounding him in the moment. The crowd was larger than ever, some standing in silent respect, others whispering amongst themselves, overcome with emotion. And then came the voice. "Why do you do this?" The words cut through the quiet like a blade. A reporter had stepped forward, her microphone gripped tightly in her hands. She was young, dressed in a crisp blazer, her eyes filled with something between curiosity and admiration. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail: the Marine's exhausted stance, the streaks of dried tears on his face, the flag he held so close. The Marine exhaled sharply. His throat was dry, his body heavy. He hadn't expected the question, but now that it had been asked, he knew there was only one answer. He turned toward the reporter, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "Because no one should be forgotten." A hush fell over the crowd. The words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity. The reporter blinked, her grip tightening on the microphone. "What do you mean?" The Marine swallowed. His body ached, but his mind was clear. "I lost my best friend. He died protecting me. He died protecting all of us. And I swore I would never let his name fade away, not while I was still standing." The camera crews inched closer, capturing every word. The entire nation was watching now. "We bury them," the Marine continued, his gaze steady. "We lay them to rest. We hold ceremonies. We engrave their names in stone. But too often the world moves on. Their sacrifice becomes a memory, a footnote in history. That's not enough." The crowd listened in silence. Some nodded, others wiped away tears. The Marine lifted the folded flag slightly. "This isn't just cloth. It's not just a symbol. It's a promise that we remember, that we honor them, that we carry their names forward so that they are never truly gone." The reporter hesitated, then asked, "Do you think your friend would be proud of you?" The Marine's breath hitched. It was a question he had never truly asked himself. Would his friend be proud? For so long he had carried guilt, believing he had failed. But now, as he stood surrounded by strangers, by veterans, by those who had come to witness his tribute, he realized something. His friend wouldn't want his suffering. His friend would want him to live. The Marine looked down at the flag, his grip tightening. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I hope so." The moment was captured instantly. Cameras flashed, news anchors spoke in hushed voices, and across the country, people watching from their homes felt something stir inside them. Within minutes, the Marine's words spread. Social media erupted. Never Forgotten began trending. Veterans, soldiers, and civilians alike shared the clip, adding the names of their own fallen loved ones. In military bases across the country, troops gathered to watch the live broadcast. In small-town diners and big city offices, people paused what they were doing, drawn into the raw, unfiltered moment unfolding before them. And thousands of miles away, in a quiet home filled with old photographs and fading memories, a mother placed her hand over her heart as she listened to the Marine speak about the son she had lost. The tribute was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone. The reporter lowered her microphone slightly. She had come expecting a news segment, but what she had found was something more, something deeply human. She took a breath before asking, "What now?" The Marine hesitated. He hadn't thought beyond this moment. For weeks, months, years, his focus had been on this tribute, this 24-hour salute, and yet, standing here, surrounded by those who shared his pain, those who understood his loss, he felt something shift inside him. What now? The bikers watched him closely. The leader, arms crossed, gave him a knowing nod. The Marine exhaled. "I keep standing." The reporter tilted her head. "For how long?" The Marine's lips pressed together. He wasn't sure. He had come here to honor his friend, to keep his memory alive. But as he looked out at the growing crowd, at the faces of those who had lost loved ones, those who had suffered their own battles, He realized it wasn't just about one person. It never had been. "For as long as it takes." The reporter's eyes softened. "Until what?" The Marine's fingers curled around the folded flag. He met her gaze, his voice steady. "Until every soldier is remembered. Until every family knows their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Until no one is left standing alone." The words sent a shiver through the crowd. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a man in the back stepped forward. He was older, his face lined with age, a Vietnam veteran's pin fastened to his jacket. With quiet reverence, he raised his hand in salute. Then another, and another. One by one, strangers, veterans, civilians, mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, lifted their hands in silent tribute. The Marine's breath hitched. He had come here believing he was alone in his grief. But he wasn't alone. He never had been. And as he returned the salute, the weight of his guilt began to lift. His mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Marine stood at the center of the cemetery, his body aching, his mind a battlefield of memories and emotions. The crowd had grown larger, but he barely registered the faces around him. His heart pounded. His breath came in uneven gasps, and despite the hands that had lifted him, despite the words that had reassured him, something inside still waged war against him. He had spoken to the world. He had shared his pain. But the fight was far from over. Because the real war wasn't against the exhaustion in his limbs. It was inside him. It was the guilt, the doubt, the part of him that whispered, "You don't deserve to be here." The Marine clenched his jaw. His fingers tightened around the folded flag. He had come so far. He had seen others stand beside him. But deep down, a voice still nagged at him, telling him that no matter how many salutes were given, none of it would bring his best friend back. And that truth was unbearable. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. More people had arrived, drawn by the broadcast, by the story that had swept across the nation. They came not just to witness, but to grieve, to remember, to share their own burdens. A woman stepped forward. She was elderly, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph. Her son had been lost decades ago, in a war many had forgotten. She placed the photograph at the base of the grave, her lips moving in silent prayer. Beside her, a young man in uniform stood stiffly, his face carefully composed, but his eyes filled with sorrow. His father had been killed in action before he was born. He had never met the man whose name he carried, but today, standing before the Marine, he felt closer to him than ever before. Another woman, tears streaking her cheeks, knelt beside the Marine and whispered, "My brother never came home." One by one, they came. Mothers, fathers, siblings, children, each carrying a loss that could never be undone. The Marine looked at them, truly looked, and for the first time he saw himself in their grief. He had believed his pain was unique, that no one could understand the weight he carried. But he had been wrong. They all carried it. A man in a wheelchair rolled forward. His uniform was decorated with medals, his posture still sharp despite his injuries. He had fought in Iraq, lost both legs in an explosion that took the lives of 3 of his closest friends. His eyes met the Marine's, filled with something knowing. "I know what you're feeling," he said, his voice steady. "The guilt, the weight, the feeling that you should have been the one instead." The Marine swallowed hard. He said nothing, but the man continued. "I carried it for years," he admitted. "Drank myself numb, pushed away my family, told myself I didn't deserve to be here." The Marine's fingers twitched. He knew those feelings all too well. "But then I realized something," the man continued. "I wasn't honoring them by hating myself. I was just wasting the life they had fought to protect." The Marine's breath hitched. He had spent so much time punishing himself, believing his suffering was the only way to pay for what had happened. But what if the real way to honor his friend wasn't through suffering, but through living? The thought sent a shiver through him. Tears burned at the edges of his vision, but he didn't fight them. He let them fall. And as they did, a hand rested on his shoulder. A woman, middle-aged, dressed in black, her eyes swollen from crying. "My son died in combat," she whispered. "He was just 21. The Marine turned to her. She was staring at him with an expression that broke something inside him. "I wake up every day and wonder why he's gone and I'm still here," she admitted. "But when I saw you standing here, when I saw what you were doing, I knew he wasn't forgotten." The Marine swallowed against the lump in his throat. "You gave me peace," she said, squeezing his arm. "Let yourself have some, too." The words struck him like a thunderclap. Let himself have peace. Could he? Had he been holding himself prisoner in his own grief for too long? The Marine glanced around at the faces surrounding him. These people had come here because they understood, because they carried their own pain, because they, too, had spent years searching for peace. And in standing here, in sharing their stories, in honoring those who were lost together, maybe, just maybe, they were finding it. Together. The Marine looked down at the flag in his hands, his chest tightening. For years he had seen it as a weight, a reminder of what he had lost. But maybe it wasn't just a burden. Maybe it was a symbol of something greater. A symbol of the lives that had been lived. A symbol of the love that had never faded. A symbol of the ones who were still here, still remembering, still carrying them forward. The Marine lifted his head. His body still ached. His heart still hurt. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was standing alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what his best friend would have wanted. The crowd watched him, waiting, wondering. Then, slowly, the Marine straightened his spine. He raised the flag to his chest, and he saluted. The cemetery was silent. Then, one by one, others followed. The bikers, the veterans, the families of the fallen, strangers who had never worn a uniform but had known loss in their own ways. Hands lifted to brows. A tribute, a promise, a bond that could never be broken. The Marine's heart pounded as he lowered his hand, the flag still clutched against his chest. He had survived the battle overseas. Now he was finally winning the battle within, and he knew this was only the beginning. The Marine stood, his body trembling from exhaustion, his heart heavier than ever. The past hours had been a whirlwind of emotions, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen next. The crowd was still growing, filled with strangers who had become something more, witnesses to his tribute, bearers of their own grief, fellow souls who understood his pain. But as he scanned the faces, his breath caught. A woman was walking toward him. She moved slowly, deliberately, the weight of years evident in the deep lines of her face. Her hair, streaked with gray, framed a face that was achingly familiar. He knew her. And as soon as their eyes met, the Marine's body went rigid. It was his best friend's mother. The Marine's heart pounded. His throat closed up, and for a long moment, he couldn't move. He had not seen her since the funeral, since the day he had stood before her, unable to speak, unable to meet her eyes, unable to face the grief he had caused. And now she was here. The woman stopped just a few feet away. The crowd had gone silent, watching, waiting. Her eyes never left his. Then, slowly, she stepped closer. The Marine wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry? That he had failed? That every day he lived with the crushing weight of guilt, knowing he had come home while her son had not? That he had spent years wishing it had been him instead? But before he could find his voice, the woman did something that shattered him. She reached out and took his hands in hers. Her grip was firm, warm, steady. And then she whispered, "My son wouldn't want you to suffer like this." The Marine stiffened. He hadn't expected kindness. He had expected blame, the same accusations he threw at himself daily. But she wasn't here to punish him. She was here to save him. The woman squeezed his hands. Her voice was gentle but strong. "He loved you," she said. "You were his family. You were his brother." The Marine's vision blurred. His hands trembled in hers. "He wouldn't want his death to destroy you," she continued. "He wouldn't want you to suffer like this." The Marine sucked in a shaky breath. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You honored him, but you have to let him go now." The words hit him like a wave, crashing into the walls around his heart. Let him go. For so long, the Marine had believed holding on to guilt, pain, and suffering was the only way to keep his best friend's memory alive. But now, looking into the eyes of the woman who had lost the most, he realized the truth. His best friend didn't need him to carry the guilt. He needed him to carry the love. The Marine's body shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. And then, finally, he broke. The weight of everything, the years of grief, the guilt, the loneliness, the pain, came crashing down all at once. A sob tore from his throat. His knees buckled. Before he could collapse, the woman pulled him into her arms. He clung to her, his body racked with silent cries. For so long, he had believed he had to carry this alone, that grief, pain, and burden were his to bear. But here, in the arms of a mother who had lost her son, he realized that wasn't true, because grief was never meant to be carried alone. Tears streamed down his face, and for the first time, he let himself feel it all. The loss, the sorrow, the unbearable ache of missing someone who was never coming back. And instead of drowning in it, he let it out. The woman held him, her hand cradling the back of his head, the way a mother would comfort a child. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be strong all the time." The Marine clenched his eyes shut, gripping her tighter. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. The woman pulled back slightly, just enough to cup his face in her hands. "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said firmly. "You loved him, and he loved you." The Marine swallowed hard. His whole life he had been searching for forgiveness, but maybe the only person who had refused to give it was himself. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded piece of fabric. She carefully unwrapped it, revealing a medal. His best friend's medal. She placed it in the Marine's palm, closing his fingers around it. "He would have wanted you to have this," she said. The Marine's breath caught. He stared down at the medal, his throat tightening. He had spent years believing he wasn't worthy of anything except guilt. But this was love. This was honor. This was a mother's way of saying, "You are still my son, too." Tears slipped down his face. He clutched the medal to his chest, pressing it against his heart. The woman smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Live for him," she whispered. The Marine exhaled shakily. For the first time in years, he felt something shift. The weight was still there, but it was lighter now. The guilt was still present, but it no longer consumed him. Because now, he understood. His best friend didn't die so that he could live in suffering. He died so that he could live. And now, it was time to start. The woman stepped back, nodding at him, and the Marine, still holding the medal close, straightened his shoulders. He lifted his chin, and he saluted. The crowd, the bikers, the veterans, one by one they followed. A silent tribute, a promise, a blessing. As the Marine lowered his hand, his gaze met the woman's one last time. "Thank you," he whispered. She simply smiled. And in that moment, he knew he would be okay. The Marine stood motionless, the weight of the medal still pressed against his chest. The crowd remained in respectful silence, as if collectively holding their breath. His best friend's mother had given him more than just a medal. She had given him permission to heal. But something inside him still held on. The wind whispered through the cemetery, rustling the flags and flowers laid upon the graves. The Marine closed his eyes, feeling the weight of memory pressing against him. And then, it happened. A feeling so profound, so unexplainable that it sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if, for the briefest moment, he wasn't standing alone. He could feel him, his best friend. Not in the physical sense, not in any way that could be seen or explained. But he was there. The Marine's breath caught as he opened his eyes, half expecting to see him standing beside him, grinning in that way he always had, ready with some sarcastic joke. But there was no one. Just the quiet, the wind, the weight of everything they had once shared. And then, his mind took him back. Back to the last mission. Back to the final moments. The sounds of gunfire filled his ears, the chaos of the battlefield flashing through his mind in an instant. He and his best friend had fought side by side, like they always had, covering each other's backs, just as they had sworn to do. But something had gone wrong. He remembered the explosion, the deafening roar, the blinding light. He remembered hitting the ground, the smell of burning, the pain searing through his body. And then, worst of all, he remembered turning his head and seeing his best friend lying just feet away, bleeding out. The Marine gasped, the memory cutting through him like a knife. He had crawled to him, ignoring the pain in his own body, ignoring the shouting in his earpiece. He had pressed his hands against the wound, desperate, panicked. "Stay with me, brother," he had begged. His best friend had smiled, blood at the corner of his mouth. "It's okay," he had whispered. "You're going to make it home." The Marine had shaken his head furiously. "Not without you." His best friend had gripped his arm, his strength fading. "Listen to me," he had said, voice barely audible. "You have to live for me." The Marine's breath hitched. "Promise me," his best friend had demanded, even as the light in his eyes began to dim. "I promise," the Marine had choked out, his heart breaking. And then, his best friend had been gone. The Marine opened his eyes, his face wet with tears. He hadn't realized he was crying. For years he had carried this memory like a curse, replaying it over and over, tormenting himself with the what-ifs. But now, standing here, he finally understood. His best friend hadn't wanted him to suffer. He hadn't wanted his death to be a prison for the ones left behind. He had wanted him to live. The Marine swallowed hard, his body trembling. He stepped forward, standing directly in front of the grave. For the first time since the funeral, he spoke to him. "I should have said goodbye," he whispered. The wind picked up slightly as if answering. "I didn't keep my promise," he admitted. "I let the guilt win." Silence. The Marine exhaled shakily. "But I hear you now?" The words were barely above a whisper, but they felt like a weight lifting. "I'll live for you," he promised. And this time, he meant it. The Marine straightened his spine, wiped his tears, and took a deep breath. Then, with the strength of every memory they had shared, he lifted his hand and saluted. It wasn't the same broken, guilt-ridden salute he had given before. This one was different. This was not a farewell of sorrow. This was a farewell of honor. The crowd watched, many wiping their own tears, understanding the magnitude of this moment. And then, one by one, they saluted with him. The bikers, the veterans, the families, even the strangers who had never known his best friend but now carried his memory in their hearts. The Marine held the salute, letting the moment settle. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. It was done. Not just the tribute, but the years of torment. His best friend's voice still echoed in his heart, but now it no longer haunted him. It guided him, and for the first time since the war, he felt free. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, swirling the leaves around the cemetery. The Marine hesitated, feeling something familiar, something unseen but deeply felt. And then, in the depths of his heart, he could almost hear it. "You did good, brother." It wasn't just imagination. It wasn't just a wish. It was a farewell. The Marine smiled, a small but genuine smile. He touched the metal on his chest, took a deep breath, and walked forward. Not just away from the grave, but toward the life he had promised to live. As he moved away from the headstone, he turned back one last time, letting the image of his best friend's name etched into the stone burn itself into his mind, not as a wound, but as a reminder that love never truly dies, that the best way to honor the fallen is not through suffering, but through living. The Marine exhaled deeply, looking ahead at the crowd that had stood beside him through these 20 hours. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he was ready for what came next. He whispered one last time, "Goodbye, brother." And then he walked forward. The Marine's body was near its breaking point. 20 hours. For 20 hours he had held the salute, through pain, through exhaustion, through the ghosts of his past. Now, every muscle in his body screamed for relief, his knees buckled under his own weight, and his vision blurred from the overwhelming strain. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The cemetery was no longer just a place of mourning. It had become something else entirely. It was a battlefield, and he was still standing. And he wasn't standing alone. The Marine had long thought himself alone in his suffering. He had spent years believing no one could understand the burden he carried. But now, looking at the crowd around him, he realized how wrong he had been. The bikers, the veterans, the families, the strangers who had arrived throughout the night and day, they all stood with him. Some saluted. Some held their hands over their hearts. Others simply stood in solemn silence, offering him their presence, their support, their strength. His tribute had started as a lone mission, a personal battle. Now it had become something greater than himself, and that realization fueled him for just a little longer. Pain pulsed through every fiber of his being. His wounded leg throbbed, the old injury reigniting a fire in his nerves. His shoulders ached, his back screamed, and every breath he took felt like it was being forced through a collapsing chest. He knew his body was reaching its limit. But so had his best friends. And if his best friend had given his last breath for something greater, then the Marine could give his last ounce of strength for this. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand straighter, to keep his arm locked in place, to hold steady even as his body trembled. And then something happened. The wind shifted, and the world took notice. Somewhere beyond the cemetery gates, beyond the quiet streets of the town, beyond the faces standing around him, the world was watching. The tribute had spread far beyond what he had ever imagined. News stations broadcasted his silent stand, his unwavering commitment. People tuned in from their homes, from workplaces, from places he'd never set foot in. Veterans across the country wiped tears from their eyes as they watched a fellow soldier stand for the fallen. Even those who had never known war, who had never lost a brother in arms, found themselves moved by the sight of him, broken but still standing. And as the hours stretched into the 20th, more began to arrive. They came in waves, parking their cars blocks away when the roads became too packed. They walked in groups, some carrying flags, some carrying flowers, some carrying nothing but the weight of their own grief. But all of them carried respect, and all of them came to stand with him. The Marine's mind teetered on the edge of consciousness. He had long stopped feeling his arms, his legs. His breaths came in shallow, labored gulps. He could feel his heartbeat in his skull, pounding relentlessly. He wasn't sure how much longer he could last. And then he heard them. The voices, not loud, not intrusive, just murmurs rippling through the crowd like waves on the shore. "You're almost there." "We've got you, Marine." Stay strong. For them. Words of encouragement, words of solidarity, words that reminded him why he was still here, still standing, still fighting for just a little longer. And it was in that moment that he realized this wasn't just his tribute anymore. It belonged to all of them, to the families who had lost, to the soldiers who had fought, to the people who understood that sacrifice never truly ended, even after the war was over. And if they could stand with him, then he could hold on just a little longer. For them. For his best friend. For all those who never made it home. His knees wobbled, his vision blurred, his mind teetered on the edge of darkness. But just as he felt himself slipping, a hand landed on his shoulder. Then another, and another. The bikers, the veterans, the strangers who had become something more. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their hands said enough. We're here. The Marine closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing their strength to hold him up, allowing himself to lean on the people who had come to stand beside him. He had carried his grief alone for so long. But not anymore. He wasn't alone anymore. A hush fell over the crowd. The news anchors speaking into their microphones lowered their voices, recognizing the significance of the moment. The Marine had reached the 20th hour. Only 4 more to go, but even 4 hours felt impossible now. He exhaled, his breath shaky, his entire body trembling under the weight of exhaustion. He was near his limit, and yet he knew he wouldn't fall. Because now he was standing for something far greater than himself. Because now they were all standing with him. And because, in the end, this wasn't just about honoring the past, it was about carrying it forward. The Marine's body was failing him. His muscles burned, his breath was ragged, and his mind drifted between exhaustion and determination. The 20-hour mark had passed, and with each agonizing second, his body pleaded for relief. But he stood his ground, because this wasn't just about him. It was about all the soldiers who never made it home. It was about their families, their legacies, and the sacrifices they had made. Then, through the haze of exhaustion, he saw a figure approaching. A man, limping slightly, wearing a military jacket. His face was lined with years of hardship, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. Something about him felt familiar. And then the Marine realized why. The man stepped forward, his gaze locked on the Marines. The crowd shifted, parting to let him through. There was something solemn, something deeply personal about the way he carried himself. The Marine barely had the energy to process his presence. But then the man spoke. "You don't know me," he said, his voice steady, "but I know you." The Marine's brow furrowed, struggling to focus. "I served with your best friend," the man continued. "He saved my life." A ripple of silence spread through the crowd. Even the reporters who had been whispering updates into their microphones fell silent. The Marine's breath caught in his throat. The man swallowed hard, as if struggling to find the right words. He glanced at the gravestone, then back at the Marine. "Your best friend pulled me out of the wreckage after our convoy was hit," he said. "I was trapped under debris, bleeding out. Everyone thought I was dead." The Marine's vision blurred, not from exhaustion this time, but from the weight of his words. "But he didn't leave me behind," the man continued. "He dragged me to safety, took a bullet in the process. He patched me up, kept me conscious. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here." The Marine's throat tightened. His best friend had never told him this. He had spoken of missions, of close calls, but never once had he mentioned saving a fellow soldier's life. "I was unconscious when the medics arrived," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. "By the time I woke up, he was gone." The words hung heavy in the air. The Marine had spent years drowning in guilt, believing he had failed his best friend. But here was a man, living proof, that his best friend's sacrifice had not been in vain. The man took a slow breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "Because of him," he said, "I got to go home. I got to see my son be born. I got to be a father." A murmur passed through the crowd. People wiped their eyes, their hearts gripped by the sheer weight of the moment. The Marine felt his knees weaken, but this time it wasn't just from exhaustion. It was from the realization that his best friend's sacrifice had not been meaningless. "I've spent years trying to find a way to honor him," the man admitted. "And when I saw what you were doing, standing here, refusing to break, I knew I had to come." The Marine opened his mouth, but no words came. His chest ached, his emotions too raw, too overwhelming. The man stepped closer, and in a quiet but firm voice he said, "You don't owe him guilt. You don't owe him pain. The only thing you owe him is to live." The Marine's breath hitched. Live. That word again. The same word his best friend had whispered with his dying breath. And now, standing before him, was the proof of what that sacrifice had meant. The man took a deep breath, then stood at attention. And then he saluted, not just as a soldier, but as a man who had been given a second chance, a man who owed his life to the very friend the Marine had been mourning for years. The Marine clenched his jaw, his throat burning with emotion. He wanted to collapse, to weep, to let the years of pain finally break free. Instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He returned the salute. The two men, bound by the same loss, the same sacrifice, held the salute for a long moment. And then, without a word, the man stepped back, allowing the Marine to continue his tribute. But something had changed. For the first time, the Marine no longer felt like he was carrying the weight alone. He was standing for his best friend, and for the lives his best friend had saved. The energy in the cemetery shifted. The moment had not just affected the Marine, it had affected everyone who had witnessed it. People stood a little taller. Veterans, young and old, raised their salutes a little higher. Mothers who had lost their sons wiped their tears, feeling, if only for a moment, that their sacrifices had not been forgotten. The Marine exhaled, his entire body shaking, but his heart felt lighter. For the first time since his best friend's death, he understood. Survivor's guilt had nearly consumed him. But in this moment, he realized his best friend had not died in vain. He had saved lives, he had left a legacy, and now it was the Marine's turn to do the same. The Marine had made it to the 20th hour, but now, as he stood amidst the weight of this revelation, he realized the final hours would be the hardest. His body was breaking down. His mind was barely holding on. But his heart was steady. Because now, he wasn't just standing in tribute. He was standing to carry his best friend's legacy forward. And no matter how much his body protested, he would finish what he started. The Marine had spent years believing he deserved to suffer, that the pain, the guilt, and the loneliness were all that remained for someone who had failed to bring his best friend home. But now, as he stood in the 21st hour, his body trembling, his breath shallow, he began to question everything. Survivor's guilt had controlled his life for too long, and for the first time, he asked himself, "Is this what my friend would have wanted?" The answer struck him harder than the exhaustion racking his body. No. His best friend had not wanted him to suffer. His dying wish had been for the Marine to live. Yet for years he had done the opposite. Tears burned in the Marine's eyes. His chest ached, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of the realization. If he truly wanted to honor his best friend, it wasn't by destroying himself. It was by living. His knees buckled, his body sagged. The ground tilted beneath him, and for a moment he felt himself slipping. The crowd gasped, watching as the Marine teetered on the edge of collapse. But before he could fall, strong hands caught him. The bikers. They had been watching him closely, their own faces etched with understanding. Veterans, warriors, men who had lived through the same battles, both on the field and within themselves. "We've got you, brother," one of them said. The Marine's throat tightened. He had spent years believing no one could carry this burden but him. Yet here they were, holding him up when he couldn't hold himself. He looked into their eyes and saw something he had been too blind to recognize before. Brotherhood. Not the one he had lost, but the one he still had. The Marine took a deep breath, forcing himself to straighten. His legs screamed in protest, his body begged for relief. But he wasn't standing alone anymore. The bikers flanked him, steadying him, refusing to let him fall. "You don't have to do this alone," one of them said. "Let us help you." For the first time in years, the Marine allowed himself to accept it. He nodded, and together they helped him stand tall once more. The crowd, which had been silent in anxious anticipation, erupted in cheers. People wiped their tears, watching in awe as the Marine, despite the agony, despite the exhaustion, chose to keep going. This was more than just a tribute now. This was a testament to resilience. The news cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it to thousands watching across the country. And among them, veterans sitting in their homes, men and women who had once felt like they were alone in their battles, saw something they had long forgotten. Hope. The Marine had spent years punishing himself, believing his suffering was proof of his loyalty. But in this moment, he realized the truth. Honoring his best friend wasn't about suffering. It was about surviving and choosing to live. One of the older bikers, a man with graying hair and a face lined with experience, stepped forward. "You remind me of us," he said, "the way we used to be before we learned how to let go." The Marine turned his head slightly, listening. The biker's voice was low, but it carried weight. "You think carrying the pain means carrying their memory," he continued. "But it don't work that way, son." The Marine swallowed hard. "You honor them by carrying their stories, their love, not their ghosts." Another biker, one who had lost a brother in combat, nodded. "You've got a family here. You don't have to do this alone." The Marine's throat tightened. For so long, he had convinced himself he was alone in this. But he wasn't. He had people who understood, people who had been where he was, and they were offering him something he never thought he deserved. Belonging. A new brotherhood. The Marine's mind drifted to the past, memories playing like distant echoes. He thought of his best friend's laughter, the way he had always found a joke, even in the worst situations. He thought of their late-night talks, of the dreams they had once shared. "You're going to be the one to make it," his best friend had once joked. "You always had more luck than me." The words haunted him now. He had lived, but was it luck? Or had his best friend somehow known, somehow chosen to protect him? "You have to live for me." His best friend's last words were no longer a burden. They were a promise. And now, in the 22nd hour, the Marine was finally ready to keep it. The Marine exhaled, steadying himself. His body still ached, his muscles still screamed, but his heart felt different. For the first time, it wasn't weighed down by guilt. For the first time, he wasn't holding on out of self-punishment. He was holding on because he had made a choice. Not to suffer, not to break, but to live. And as the 22nd hour ticked closer, the Marine straightened his shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. He was no longer just surviving. He was choosing to move forward. The bikers saw the shift in his stance, the quiet acceptance in his eyes. They gave him a nod, not just of respect, but of understanding. They had been where he was. They knew what it meant to carry grief and what it took to finally let it go. One of them spoke, his voice low and steady. "It ain't about forgetting, brother. It's about remembering the right way." The Marine met his gaze, and for the first time in years, he understood. It was never about holding on to the pain. It was about holding on to the love. And as he stood, ready for the final stretch, he carried not the weight of loss, but the strength of everything his best friend had ever meant to him. The final hour had begun. 23 hours of pain, endurance, and memories had brought the Marine to this moment. His body was barely holding together, his legs trembling, his arms aching beyond anything he had ever known. The world around him blurred as exhaustion threatened to consume him. And yet, he stood. This wasn't just about him anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about his best friend, about the men and women who never made it home, about the families watching from the crowd, the veterans who had traveled miles to stand beside him, the strangers who saw in his struggle something greater than one man's suffering. The final test of his endurance had arrived. The Marine gritted his teeth, refusing to let his arm drop. Every muscle burned. His wounded leg screamed in protest. His vision darkened at the edges, but he held on. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. The bikers stood with him, their salutes unwavering. Veterans of different wars, men and women who had carried their own ghosts, held their hands to their foreheads, joining him in his tribute. A silent force of respect spread through the cemetery. The moment had transcended a simple tribute. It had become something sacred. And then, through the hush of the gathered crowd, a distant sound pierced the air. A lone bugle. The first mournful notes of taps rang out, soft but powerful. The Marine's breath hitched. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as the familiar melody washed over him. His mind flashed back. To a battlefield. To the final time he had seen his best friend. To the promise he had made. You have to live for me. He had spent years carrying guilt, believing he had failed. But standing here, surrounded by people who understood, people who saw his struggle and stood beside him, he realized something. He had never been alone. His best friend had never left him. The bugler continued, each note carrying the weight of every soldier lost, every brother and sister in arms who had given everything. Tears streamed down the faces of those gathered. Mothers clutched their folded flags. Fathers held back sobs, standing tall in honor of their children. The Marine's own eyes burned, but he refused to break. His hand remained firm in salute. The weight of the past, of years of grief, pressed down on him. But he stood taller. I lived for you. The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time they no longer felt like chains. They felt like purpose. He had survived, not to suffer, not to be consumed by guilt, but to carry on the legacy of those who had fallen. As the final note of taps faded, the cemetery was silent. Then, one by one, the veterans in the crowd lowered their salutes. The Marine was the last to hold his. His body screamed for release, but he held firm. Not yet. Not until the 24th hour struck. Not until his mission was complete. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, his mind fighting against the exhaustion trying to pull him under. The sun was beginning to rise in the distance, a faint glow peeking over the horizon. A new day, a new beginning. And still he stood. His knees threatened to buckle. His arm trembled. But he had made it this far. And he would finish what he started. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. People held their breath, watching, waiting, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A veteran stepped forward, an older man, his hair white with age, his uniform neatly pressed. A soldier from a different war, a different time, but a man who understood. He gave the Marine a deep, respectful nod, and then he saluted. The Marine, struggling to keep his eyes open, returned the nod. He recognized what the man was saying without words. You are not alone. More veterans followed, saluting him, honoring him. The Marine felt the weight of their respect settle over him, strengthening him, giving him the last bit of endurance he needed. The clock ticked closer to the final moment. He had done it. He had endured. For his best friend, for the fallen, for those who still carried their memories. And as the last minutes passed, he felt something shift inside him. Something heavy finally lifting. Something that had chained him for years finally setting him free. The world seemed to slow. His body wavered. His breath shuddered. And then, at exactly the 24th hour, the Marine lowered his salute. A collective gasp echoed through the cemetery. For a single moment, time seemed to freeze. Then his knees gave out. The bikers moved instantly, catching him before he hit the ground. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a thunderous wave of tears, respect, and understanding. He had done it. He had honored them. And he had survived. As the sun rose higher, a new chapter in his life had begun. And he wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the Marine lay in the arms of his brothers, he felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Not the hollow peace of isolation, but the kind that came with acceptance. The kind that came with knowing he had given everything he had to honor the fallen, and now, finally, he was ready to live. One of the bikers gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. "You did good, brother." The Marine nodded weakly, barely able to keep his eyes open. He could hear the soft murmurs of the crowd, the sniffles, the whispered prayers, and the gentle rustling of the flags in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to rest. The Marine had held on for 24 relentless hours. He had fought against the pain, the exhaustion, the grief that had weighed on him for years. He had stood for his fallen best friend, for every soldier who never made it home, for the families who carried the loss. And now, his body had finally reached its breaking point. As he lowered his salute, the weight of his own suffering came crashing down on him. His legs buckled, his vision blurred, the world tilted. Before he could hit the ground, strong arms caught him. The bikers had been ready. He barely registered the voices around him. He felt himself being lowered to the grass, the cool morning dew soaking through his uniform. His breaths were shallow, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. But even as the world spun around him, he could hear them. The quiet sobs of the onlookers, the murmured prayers, the hushed voices of veterans saluting him with tears in their eyes. He had done it. He had endured. But now he was fading. "Someone get a medic." The voice was distant, but urgent. A woman, one of the nurses from the crowd, was already by his side, checking his pulse, her hand shaking slightly as she assessed him. "He's dehydrated. He's in shock. We need to get him to a hospital. Now." The bikers closed ranks around him, shielding him from the overwhelming press of the crowd. "Hold on, brother," one of them whispered, gripping his shoulder. He tried to respond, but his lips wouldn't move. The exhaustion was too heavy. His mind drifted, slipping between reality and memory. Suddenly, he was back in the desert. The sound of gunfire filled his ears. Smoke burned his lungs. His best friend was beside him, shouting something, but the words were lost in the chaos. And then, a blast. The dust, the ringing, the deafening silence that followed. He turned, his hands scrambling to pull his friend from the wreckage. Blood. Blood. So much blood. "You have to live for me." The voice was barely a whisper. He shook his head violently. "No, don't you dare." But his best friend was already slipping away. And just like that, the war had taken him. The Marine gasped, his body jerking violently. "He's coming to," the nurse said. "Stay with me, soldier." He forced his eyes open. The sun was rising, the golden light cutting through the morning mist. And then he saw her. A woman standing a few feet away, clutching a folded American flag to her chest. His best friend's mother. She had been watching him this whole time. Tears ran down her face, but there was something else in her expression. Not grief. Pride. He tried to sit up, but the bikers held him down. "Easy, man," one of them said. "You need to rest." But he couldn't rest. Not yet. Because in this moment, he finally understood. For years, he had believed he failed his best friend. He had carried the weight of that battlefield, the guilt of being the one who survived. But looking at his best friend's mother now, he realized something. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She was proud of him, not because he had suffered, but because he had honored her son's memory in a way that truly mattered. And in that moment, the guilt that had shackled him for years began to crack. He had not failed. He had survived. And now, he had to live. The Marine swallowed hard, his throat dry. With great effort, he lifted a trembling hand to his forehead. One final salute, not out of duty, not out of guilt, but out of love. His best friend's mother stepped forward, kneeling beside him. She reached out, gently touching his face, her fingers cool against his fevered skin. "My son would be so proud of you," she whispered. The tears he had fought so hard to hold back finally broke free. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not out of pain, not out of guilt, but out of healing. The ambulance arrived, the paramedics rushing to stabilize him. As they worked, the crowd remained silent, watching with reverence, understanding that they had witnessed something profound. One of the bikers leaned in. "We've got you, brother." The Marine nodded weakly, allowing himself to be lifted onto the stretcher. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, he turned his head one last time, looking at the sea of people who had stood with him, who had mourned with him, who had reminded him that he was not alone. And, as the doors closed, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "I lived for you." As the ambulance pulled away, the Marine caught one final glimpse of the cemetery. The people still standing in silent tribute, the flags fluttering in the morning breeze, the bikers standing tall like sentinels of memory. And amidst them all, his best friend's mother, holding the folded flag close to her heart. She raised a hand in farewell, not in goodbye, but in gratitude. And in that moment, the Marine knew he had done what he came to do, not just to honor the fallen, but to finally start living again. He let out a slow, exhausted breath as the ambulance turned the corner, the cemetery disappearing from sight. The battle he had fought within himself for years had reached its climax, but instead of an ending, it had given him something else, a second chance. The road ahead would not be easy. He knew that, but for the first time he was ready to take it. Darkness, silence. Then, a slow, rhythmic beeping. The Marine's mind floated in a void, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like an anchor. He wasn't sure how much time had passed or where he was. His body ached. Every inch of him felt like it had been through a war all over again. Then, a voice. Soft. Distant. "He's waking up." The words pulled him from the depths of unconsciousness, and with great effort he forced his heavy eyelids open. Bright light, white ceiling, the unmistakable sterile smell of antiseptic. He was in a hospital. The realization hit him like a wave, followed by the rush of fragmented memories. The salute, the final hour, the bikers catching him before he hit the ground, the bugler playing taps, the crowd, the tears, and then the collapse. His chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. He was still alive. A second chance. As his eyes adjusted, he became aware of figures in the room. A doctor flipping through a chart, a nurse checking his IV. And then he saw them. The bikers. They sat in the chairs lining the hospital room, their presence quiet but strong. They had stayed. They hadn't left him. One of them, the oldest, noticed his open eyes and leaned forward. His face was lined with experience, his hair graying at the temples. "You scared the hell out of us, brother," he said with a small smile. The Marine tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse quickly brought him a cup of water, pressing a straw to his lips. He drank slowly, letting the cool liquid soothe his throat. Finally, he managed to rasp out, "How long?" The doctor glanced up. "You've been unconscious for nearly a full day. Your body shut down from exhaustion and dehydration. You're lucky we got you here when we did." The Marine nodded weakly. It made sense. He had pushed himself far beyond his limits, but somehow he had survived. One of the younger bikers pulled out his phone. "Man, you have no idea what's happening out there." The Marine frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. The biker turned the phone toward him, showing the screen. A news broadcast was playing. A reporter stood outside the cemetery, the footage behind her showing thousands of people gathered, holding flags, standing in silent tribute. The words on the screen made his breath catch. "A nation moved, the Marines' 24-hour salute inspires the country." The broadcaster continued. In a moment of unprecedented solidarity, veterans, bikers, and citizens across the country have been holding their own 24-hour salutes in honor of fallen soldiers. What began as one Marine's personal tribute has sparked a movement, one that has reminded the nation of the sacrifices made by our men and women in uniform. The Marine swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had never wanted attention. He had done it for his best friend, for himself. But somehow, his pain, his tribute, had become something more, something bigger than him. The oldest biker, the one who had first spoken to him, leaned forward. "You set something in motion, brother. People needed to see this. They needed to remember." The Marine let that sink in. For years he had believed he was alone in his pain, that no one understood, that no one cared. But he had been wrong. People did care. They had just needed a reason to come together, and somehow his tribute had given them that. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the hospital blanket. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do now. But for the first time in years, he felt something other than guilt. He felt purpose. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The nurse stepped aside as a woman entered the room. The Marine's breath caught. It was his best friend's mother. She looked tired, but there was warmth in her eyes as she approached his bedside. The bikers stood respectfully, giving them space. She sat down in the chair beside him, taking his hand gently in hers. "I wanted to see you," she said softly. The Marine swallowed hard. "Ma'am, She shook her head. No apologies. No guilt. She squeezed his hand. "You have given me something no one else could. You made sure my son's name wasn't forgotten." Tears burned at the edges of his vision. "Thank you," she whispered. The Marine had no words. None were needed. For years he had believed he had failed her son. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized she didn't see him as a failure. She saw him as someone who had carried a burden too heavy to bear alone. And now he didn't have to carry it anymore. The doctor spoke up. "You're going to need time to recover. Your body took a serious hit." The Marine nodded. He knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had spent too many years running from himself, punishing himself. That had to change. One of the bikers cleared his throat. "When you're ready, we've got a spot for you. You don't have to do this alone anymore." A new brotherhood. A second chance. The Marine let out a slow breath, feeling the weight that had been crushing him for so long finally begin to lift. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was ready to live. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. The Marine sat upright in bed, the IV still attached to his arm, but the strength had started to return to his body. More importantly, a new clarity had settled in his mind. For years he had been lost, trapped in guilt, in grief, in the weight of the past. But now, something had shifted. He had been given a second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The knock on the door was firm, familiar. The bikers entered, their leather jackets and weathered faces standing in sharp contrast to the sterile white walls of the hospital. "You look better," one of them said, pulling up a chair. The Marine exhaled. "I feel different." "Yeah." The oldest biker, the one who had caught him during the collapse, leaned forward. "Different how?" The Marine stared at his hands, his calloused fingers resting on the thin hospital blanket. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm drowning." The older biker nodded. "That's what happens when you stop carrying everything alone." Silence stretched between them. Then the older biker continued. "Listen, brother, we meant what we said. When you get out of here, you've got a place with us. You don't have to figure out what comes next by yourself." The Marine hesitated. The offer was tempting, but he wasn't sure if he was ready. One of the other bikers grinned. "We ain't saying you gotta hop on a bike tomorrow. Just know the door's open." The Marine nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." More than they knew. Over the next few days, he had plenty of time to think. The hospital room felt like a limbo, a place between the life he had known and whatever came next. Visitors came and went. Veterans, families of fallen soldiers, strangers who had seen his tribute and just wanted to thank him. It was overwhelming, but it also opened his eyes. People cared. People were looking for something to hold on to, something to remind them that their pain, their losses, their sacrifices meant something. And somehow, in standing for 24 hours, he had given them that. He had been stuck in his own grief for so long that he had never realized just how many others were suffering too. And that's when he understood. His mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. On the 5th day, the doctor entered the room with his discharge papers. "You're free to go," she said, smiling, "though I'd strongly recommend taking it easy for a while." The Marine nodded, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. His body still ached, but there was strength in his movements. The past 24 hours had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. And now, he was ready to start again. As he pulled on his clothes, a simple t-shirt and jeans, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. For the first time in years, he didn't just see a soldier who had survived. He saw a man who was ready to live. When he stepped outside, the sun was bright, the air crisp. The hospital parking lot was lined with motorcycles, their engines silent for now. The bikers stood nearby, waiting. One of them tossed him a helmet. "Just in case you feel like joining us someday." The Marine smirked, tucking it under his arm. "I'll think about it." Another biker clapped him on the shoulder. "No rush, just know you're not alone." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years believing he had to bear everything on his own. But now, he realized, he didn't. The weight of the past was still there. It probably always would be. But now, he had people who understood, people who had his back. And for the first time, he was ready to let them. The next few weeks were a blur. Interviews, news stories, endless messages from people all over the country. At first, he wasn't sure how to handle it. He had never wanted attention. But then he started reading the letters. Veterans reaching out, telling him how they had been on the edge, how his tribute had reminded them that they weren't alone. Mothers and fathers of fallen soldiers thanking him for honoring their children. Young recruits inspired to serve. And that's when he knew. This wasn't just about him anymore. The Marine picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages. Then he took a deep breath and started responding. One message at a time. One story at a time. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that no one should have to carry their battles alone. And if he could help even one person find their way through the darkness, then that was a mission worth fighting for. One evening, he found himself back at the cemetery, the place where it had all started. He stood before his best friend's grave, the wind rustling the flags left behind by strangers who had come to pay their respects. He rested a hand on the headstone, letting the silence settle around him. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted quietly, "but I'm not running from it anymore." For the first time, the guilt didn't feel so heavy. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He took a deep breath and turned to leave, the headlights of waiting motorcycles glowing softly in the distance. A new road lay ahead, and this time he was ready to take it. The Marine had spent years trapped in the past, carrying the weight of memories too heavy to bear alone. But now, as he stood on the edge of something new, he realized that grief didn't have to be a prison. It could be a foundation. He had survived for a reason, and it was time to turn his pain into purpose. It started as a simple idea, something small, something to give back. In the weeks following his 24-hour salute, letters continued to pour in. Veterans from across the country reached out, sharing their stories, their struggles. Some admitted they had been on the brink, ready to give up, until they saw him standing in that cemetery, refusing to break. He had no idea his tribute would resonate with so many, but it had. And now he knew what he had to do. With the help of the bikers, he started making calls, reaching out to organizations, speaking to fellow veterans. The idea formed quickly, a foundation dedicated to helping veterans battling PTSD, not just with therapy but with something deeper, something real, brotherhood, support, a reason to keep going. He called it the Salute Project. The mission was simple. No veteran should feel alone. Launching the foundation was harder than he expected. There were legal hurdles, endless meetings, funding concerns. But he didn't let the obstacles stop him. He poured himself into the work, reaching out to veterans, hosting gatherings, building a community where those who had served could find solace, understanding, and purpose. The bikers stood by him every step of the way. They weren't just supporters. They were the backbone of the foundation. They opened their clubhouse, turning it into a safe haven for veterans who needed somewhere to go, someone to talk to. They organized rides, fundraisers, events, all in the name of the Salute Project. And then the first big idea came. The tribute that had started everything, the 24-hour salute, wouldn't just be his personal moment anymore. It would become an annual event, a nationwide tribute. Veterans, families, and supporters from every state would gather each year to honor the fallen. And just like that, the movement began. 1 year after his own tribute, he found himself standing in the same cemetery, in the same spot where he had once struggled to stay on his feet. But this time, he wasn't alone. Thousands had gathered. Veterans from all branches, Gold Star families, active duty soldiers, bikers, and civilians who simply wanted to show their support. The cemetery was lined with flags. Candles flickered in the evening breeze. He stood at attention, hand raised in a salute. But this time, it wasn't just him. Across the country, in different cities and towns, others stood with him. Military bases held their own salutes. Schools took moments of silence. News stations covered the event, sharing stories of veterans who had found hope in something as simple as one man standing in the rain, refusing to give up. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about every soldier who never made it home, every veteran who still carried the war inside them, every family who had lost someone but refused to let their memory fade. And as he stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized something. His best friend wasn't just a memory. He was part of this. His sacrifice had led to something greater, and that was a legacy worth carrying forward. After the ceremony, as the crowds dispersed, a young soldier approached him. He was barely out of boot camp, his uniform still crisp, his eyes filled with something the Marine recognized: the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "Sir," the young soldier said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, what you did, what you started, it matters." The Marine nodded, shaking the young man's hand. "You matter," he said. "Never forget that." The soldier gave a firm nod before stepping back, disappearing into the crowd. The Marine exhaled, looking up at the night sky. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. Not just for himself, but for all those who couldn't. As the last few people trickled away from the cemetery, the Marine turned to see the bikers still standing by their motorcycles. One of them nodded toward him. "You ready for what comes next?" The Marine took a deep breath. He knew that life after war wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering the right way. "I am," he said. The oldest biker clapped him on the shoulder. "Then let's make sure no one's left behind." The roar of motorcycles echoed in the night as they rode away, leaving behind a cemetery filled with flags, candles, and silent prayers. A promise that they would return. A promise that the fallen would never be forgotten. A promise that their legacy would live on. As they rode, the Marine found himself reflecting on the past year. The pain hadn't disappeared. It never would, but it had transformed. It had become something greater than just his own suffering. It had become a movement, a mission. His best friend had given his life so others could live. And now the Marine was doing the same, honoring that sacrifice by ensuring others found the strength to move forward. The road stretched ahead, open and endless. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of where it led. He twisted the throttle, feeling the engine rumble beneath him, the wind rushing past. A new mission awaited. A new purpose had been found. And he was ready. The road had been long, filled with pain, grief, and guilt. But now, for the first time in years, the Marine had clarity. He had spent so much time questioning why he had survived, why his best friend had died instead of him. He had searched for meaning in his suffering. And now, standing before the familiar grave, he knew. The meaning wasn't in the suffering. It was in the living. The cemetery was quiet, the air thick with the scent of rain from a passing storm. The sun peeked through the gray clouds, casting golden light over the rows of white headstones. The Marine walked slowly, each step measured, deliberate. The weight in his chest felt different this time, not the crushing burden of guilt, but the solemn responsibility of remembrance. He wasn't the same man who had stood here a year ago. That man had been drowning. This man had learned how to swim. As he neared his best friend's grave, he inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He had spent so long running from this moment. But now, he was ready. He knelt down, brushing fallen leaves away from the engraved name. His fingers traced the letters, each one holding a lifetime of memories. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, "I lived for you." The words settled between them, carried by the wind. And in that moment, he knew his friend would be proud. He let the memories wash over him. Their time in boot camp, their late-night talks in the barracks, the stupid jokes that had kept them sane in a world that tried to break them. And, of course, the last mission. He had replayed it 1,000 times in his head, always questioning what he could have done differently. But now, after everything, he saw it clearly. His best friend hadn't died because of him. He had died protecting the men beside him. He had died a hero, and no amount of guilt would change that. The Marine exhaled slowly, the realization settling deep in his bones. His best friend wouldn't have wanted him to waste his life in sorrow. He would have wanted him to live. A soft voice broke the silence. "You finally made it back." He turned to see his best friend's mother standing a few feet away. She had aged, but her strength remained. She carried flowers, her expression gentle but knowing. "I wasn't sure if I would," the Marine admitted. She walked closer, kneeling beside him as she placed the bouquet at her son's grave. "But you did." He nodded. "I did." She studied him for a long moment, then reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice firm. "You never had to carry this alone." The Marine swallowed hard. "I thought I had to." She squeezed his hand. "No, son. That's not what my boy would have wanted." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her words. She was right, and he had wasted too many years believing otherwise. For the first time, the Marine didn't feel like he was saying goodbye. He had always feared coming back to this place, afraid it would break him. But now he saw it differently. This wasn't where his best friend was buried. This was where his story continued. The Marine placed a hand on the headstone one last time, feeling the cold granite beneath his palm. Then, with a deep breath, he stood. His best friend's mother stood with him, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "You found your way," she said softly. He nodded. "Yeah, I think I did." They walked back toward the cemetery entrance together, side by side, and for the first time the Marine felt free. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wasn't afraid of it anymore. As he stepped outside the cemetery gates, he found the bikers waiting for him, their motorcycles lined up along the road. One of them handed him a helmet. "You ready for the next ride?" The Marine looked back one last time at the cemetery, at the rows of white headstones, at the life he had left behind. Then he turned forward. Smiling, he took the helmet. "Yeah, I'm ready." The engines roared to life as the bikers took off down the highway, the Marine riding alongside them. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was riding toward his future. As the bike roared down the open road, the Marine felt something unexplainable. Like the past was no longer pulling him down. Like his best friend was right there with him, in the wind, in the sky, in the rumble of the engine beneath him. And for the first time in years, he smiled without hesitation. He wasn't just living for his friend anymore. He was living for himself. The road stretched long ahead of him, but before he could focus on the future, he took one last glance in his mirror. The cemetery was a small dot in the distance now, fading from view. But its presence would never fade from his heart. Memories didn't have to be chains. They could be guides. His best friend's voice seemed to echo in his mind, soft but steady. "You did good, brother. Now go live." And so he did. The open road stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt winding through the rolling hills. The Marine gripped the handlebars of the borrowed motorcycle, the wind rushing past him, the rhythmic hum of the engine steady beneath him. For the first time in a long time, he felt weightless. Not empty, not lost, just free. It had started as an idea, a simple ride across the country, a tribute to the ones who never made it home. But as word spread, what began as a handful of riders grew into something more. Veterans from all over reached out, wanting to join. Men and women who had lost brothers and sisters in combat, who had been carrying their own burdens in silence, found something in this ride. A purpose, a connection, a way to honor the fallen. By the time they set off, their convoy had grown into something powerful. Dozens of bikes thundered down the highway, a procession of steel and leather, of flags whipping in the wind. At every stop, people waited. In small towns and big cities, communities gathered to greet them, to share stories, to thank them. Gold Star families stood by the roadside, holding pictures of their lost loved ones, hands over their hearts. Veterans saluted as they passed. The Marine had never seen anything like it. This wasn't just a ride. This was a reminder. No one was ever truly gone as long as they were remembered. One evening, as the convoy pulled off the road to rest, they camped beneath the vast expanse of stars. The fire crackled, sending embers into the night, the low murmur of voices blending with the rustle of the wind. The Marine sat among them, feeling the warmth of the fire, the presence of those who had become his new family. One of the older bikers leaned forward. "You ever think we'd be here?" The Marine shook his head. "Not like this." Another veteran, a quiet man with deep scars on his arms, stared into the flames. "It helps, doesn't it?" "What?" the Marine asked. The man exhaled. "Being with people who understand, carrying the weight together." The Marine nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." For years he had believed healing was something he had to do alone. But now he understood. Healing was something they did together. The fire crackled, and for the first time in a long time, the Marine didn't feel like he was fighting his battles alone. The convoy's last stop was Arlington National Cemetery. As they rolled through the gates, the thunder of engines faded into silence, the weight of where they were settled deep into their bones. Row after row of white headstones stretched into the distance. A silent army, a reminder of those who had given everything. The Marine parked his bike and dismounted, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he walked toward a familiar spot. His best friend's grave. The others gave him space, understanding this was a moment he needed. He knelt, resting a hand on the cool stone. "We did it," he whispered. "We carried your memory across the country. You were with us the whole way." The wind rustled through the trees, as if whispering back. A lump formed in his throat, but it wasn't sadness. It was something else. Gratitude. For the time they had, for the lessons learned, for the chance to live when his best friend could not. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small patch from his jacket, the insignia from their old unit. Carefully, he placed it at the base of the headstone. A piece of their story left behind. A promise that his best friend would never be forgotten. As he stood, the bikers formed a line behind him. Without a word, one by one, they raised their hands in salute. A moment of silence stretched, heavy with meaning, with respect, with love. The Marine held his salute, not out of grief, but out of honor. His best friend's mother stood nearby, watching with misty eyes. She nodded once, silent, but the look in her gaze said everything. He had kept his promise. The Marine lowered his hand slowly, exhaling. This chapter of his journey had ended, but another was just beginning. As they mounted their bikes once more, the Marine glanced at the sky, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The ride had started as a tribute, but now it was something more. It was a new beginning. Engines rumbled to life, and as they rode away from Arlington, the Marine knew he would return, not out of obligation, but because some bonds never fade, and some promises are meant to last forever. As the miles stretched before him, the Marine felt an unfamiliar sensation settle within him: peace. For the longest time, he had believed peace was something he would never find. But now, he realized it had been there all along, waiting for him to be ready to accept it. His best friend's sacrifice had not been in vain, because the Marine had finally learned what it meant to live. And as the wind roared around him, he whispered one last time, "I'll carry you with me. Always." The road was long, but for the first time he was looking forward to every mile. The Marine had spent years trapped in his own mind, suffocating beneath the weight of guilt and loss. But now, as he rode down the open highway, the wind against his face, the roar of engines beside him, he realized something he had never truly accepted before. He was alive, and for the first time, he was grateful for it. There had been nights when he didn't think he'd make it to morning. Nights where the silence was too loud, where the ghosts of war whispered in his ear, reminding him of what he had lost. There had been mornings where he woke up feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Days where the world felt like an illusion, where every smile he forced was another piece of armor to keep people from seeing how broken he truly was. For years he had been existing, but he had never truly lived. Until now, until this ride, until this brotherhood. The convoy stopped in a small town, welcomed by locals who had heard about their journey. Veterans, families of the fallen, and strangers who simply wanted to shake their hands gathered at the town square, sharing stories, laughter, and remembrance. As they ate together at long tables under the glow of streetlights, the Marine watched the people around him, men and women who had also faced their own demons, who had carried their own burdens. He had spent so long thinking he was alone in his pain, but looking around, he knew now, he never had been. One of the bikers sat beside him, pushing a cold beer into his hands. "You're thinking too much," the older man chuckled. The Marine smirked. I guess I'm just realizing how close I was to missing this." The biker nodded, his expression turning serious. "We all were, at some point. That's why we do this. That's why we ride." The Marine looked down at the condensation on the glass, his grip tightening slightly. "I don't think I ever really wanted to die," he admitted. The biker tilted his head. "Then what was it?" "I just didn't know how to live." Silence stretched between them for a moment before the biker lifted his beer. "Then it's a damn good thing you figured it out." The Marine clinked his bottle against the biker's, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it was." Later that night, as the town quieted and most of the riders settled into their rooms or campsites, the Marine found himself wandering. He ended up at a small memorial in the center of town, a stone monument with names etched into the surface, a tribute to fallen soldiers from the area. Candles flickered at the base of the stone, their glow casting shadows across the engraved letters. The Marine ran his fingers over the names, recognizing the weight each one carried for the people who had placed them there. He pulled a small coin from his pocket, the one he had carried since his best friend's funeral, the one that had been a symbol of his guilt, his sorrow. He placed it gently on the memorial, not as a burden, but as a tribute, a promise that he would live not just for himself, but for those who no longer could. As he walked back toward the motel where the bikers had set up for the night, the Marine felt lighter than he had in years. He didn't have all the answers. He still had battles ahead of him. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of them. One of the bikers was leaning against a wall outside, smoking a cigarette. He raised an eyebrow as the Marine approached. "You good?" The Marine exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I think I am." The biker smirked. "Damn right, you are." They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool around them. The Marine turned his gaze up toward the stars. He thought about his best friend, about the men he had lost, about the people who had stood beside him when he couldn't stand on his own. And he realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. The next morning, as the convoy prepared to set off again, the Marine felt a sense of peace settle into his chest. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a feeling. And for the first time, he felt like he had found it. He strapped on his helmet, revved the engine, and smiled. Because the road ahead was long, and he was ready for it. That evening, after another long ride, the Marine found himself staring at the sky, lost in thought. The ride had changed him. But change meant something else too, responsibility. He had found a way to survive. Now it was time to help others do the same. As he sat around the fire with the other bikers, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking." The group turned toward him, waiting. "I want to do more," he admitted. "I don't want this ride to just be a one-time thing." One of the older bikers smirked. "It doesn't have to be." The Marine nodded. "I want to start something. A way to reach veterans who are struggling, guys like me who thought they were alone." The leader of the group leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Sounds like you've got a mission, brother." The Marine exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I think I do." And with that, the next chapter of his life began. Not just as a survivor, but as someone who was going to make a difference. The Marine had spent years carrying the weight of his past, haunted by memories of war, loss, and survivor's guilt. But now, as he stood before the gathered crowd, dressed in a clean, pressed jacket, his shoulders squared, his head held high, he realized something profound. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a man who had learned to live again. And today, he would honor that journey with one final salute. The event had started as a tribute, but it had become something much bigger. Hundreds of people filled the memorial park. Veterans, bikers, Gold Star families, active duty soldiers, and civilians who had followed his story. They stood shoulder to shoulder, holding small flags, waiting in silence. Among them was his best friend's mother, standing in the front row. She clutched a folded American flag against her chest, her eyes shining with emotion. The Marine took a deep breath. A year ago, he had stood alone in a cemetery, lost in grief. Now, he stood among family. A microphone had been set up for him, but when he stepped forward, he hesitated. What could he say that would do justice to everything that had happened? He cleared his throat, gripping the podium. "A year ago, I thought my life had ended," he began, his voice steady. "I thought I was nothing more than a soldier who had survived when others didn't. I carried that weight for a long time." The crowd was silent, listening. But then, something changed. "I stood for 24 hours to honor my best friend, and in that time, I realized something I had been too afraid to face." He exhaled slowly. "I was never alone." A murmur moved through the crowd. "We all carry burdens," he continued. "We all have moments where we think we can't go on. But the truth is, we don't have to carry them alone. We stand together. We heal together. We live for those who no longer can." A single tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. "I once asked myself why I survived when my best friend didn't. I don't have the perfect answer, but I do know this. Surviving isn't enough. We have to live, and we have to make sure that no one is forgotten." He turned to face his best friend's mother, his voice thick with emotion. "Your son was a hero," he said softly, "and I promise you, as long as I live, I will honor him." She gave a small nod, pressing a hand to her heart, and that was all the validation he needed. The Marine stepped back, standing at attention. A bugler began to play taps, the mournful notes drifting across the park. Slowly, he raised his right hand to his forehead, standing tall, every fiber of his being pouring into this final tribute. One by one, the bikers behind him did the same. The veterans followed. Then the entire crowd, hundreds of people saluting in unison. Not just for him, not just for his best friend, but for every soldier who had given their life. The Marine held the salute until the last note of the bugle faded. Then he lowered his hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. As soon as the ceremony ended, his best friend's mother approached him. She reached out, and without hesitation, he stepped into her embrace. "You did him proud," she whispered against his shoulder. The Marine closed his eyes, nodding. "I hope so." She pulled back, cupping his face gently. "I know so." The weight he had carried for so long lifted in that moment. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally learned how to carry it the right way. As the crowd began to disperse, one of the bikers clapped a hand on his shoulder. "So, what now?" The Marine looked at the horizon, at the open road, at the life still waiting to be lived. "I don't know," he admitted. "But for the first time, I'm excited to find out." The biker grinned. "Then let's ride." The Marine chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, let's ride." The engines roared to life as the convoy prepared to set off once more. This time, it wasn't just a tribute ride. This time, it was a journey forward. A journey toward a future he had once believed he would never see. As the wind rushed past him, he whispered a final promise to his best friend, to himself, to the road ahead. "I will live." And for the first time in years, he truly meant it. As the motorcycles rumbled down the road, the Marine found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him here. The battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, the grief he had carried for too long. But he also thought about the ones who had stood beside him, the ones who had lifted him when he couldn't stand on his own, the ones who had reminded him that life was still worth living. His best friend's memory would always be a part of him. But now, it was a light, not a burden. As the road stretched ahead, endless and open, the Marine smiled. Not just because he had survived, but because he had found his way home. Weeks later, the Marine stood once again at his best friend's grave, this time alone. But he didn't feel sorrow. He felt gratitude. Kneeling down, he placed a small patch beside the headstone, a symbol of the brotherhood he had found along the way. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." A breeze swept through the trees, rustling the flags that lined the cemetery. He liked to think it was his best friend's way of responding. With one final salute, he stood, turned toward the waiting convoy, and walked forward, because there was still so much more to live for.